I recently found this post on Reddit claiming that early Latter-day Saint missionary work in Scandinavia was really just a thinly veiled sex trafficking operation bent on funneling young women into the Utah plural marriage machine. Here's the deal. One of my biggest pet peeves is when critics take a subject that is really worth talking about, like polygamy, and then dilute it by piling on other clearly sensationalized claims like this one. So in this video, I want to dive in and learn what I can about this claim, but then I want to cut through the sensational and explore some more practical questions. How many women in Utah actually practiced polygamy? What did a polygamous proposal look like? And if things went south, what did divorce look like? First things first, were missionaries trafficking young Scandinavian girls? Well, the first red flag is that there is no source attached to this meme, and the Reddit user is clearly hostile to the church. Nonetheless, if missionaries were targeting and trafficking Scandinavian women to Utah, I figured it should be reflected in Scandinavian immigration statistics from the 1800s. If I could find that information somewhere to begin with. The hunt was on, and it actually wasn't long before I struck gold. I learned that out of over 10,000 Scandinavian converts who emigrated between 1853 and 1882, 74% did so in family groups. About 15% were marriageable women, and 12% were marriageable men, and many of these eligible individuals naturally ended up marrying each other. All prevalent notions to the contrary, these Scandinavian converts by and large embraced Mormonism in families. Lurid stories of abduction to supply women for Utah's supposed harems had their germ in occasional runaways and desertions, but the statistics and the accounts of the converts themselves provide a convincing, not to say startling, corrective of folklore. This Reddit post is really just a modernized version of the sensationalized 1800s anti-Mormon political cartoons that we all know and love. But let's put the sensational aside for a moment and talk about reality for a bit. In reality, how many women actually even practiced polygamy in Utah? Well, ChatGPT gave me a quote from this book that supposedly answered this question, but I trust ChatGPT about as far as I can throw it. So I went to the library, found the book, came home, and lo and behold, ChatGPT had indeed lied to my face.
I think I'm gonna have a heart attack and die from that surprise.
It turns out that this data is not particularly easy to find either. My search continued until I found this article, which tried to take a demographic snapshot of polygamy in 3 different wards in Salt Lake City at its absolute height, that's a key phrase there, in 1860. Researchers found that 44% of women were married polygamously, 36% monogamously, and 20% were unmarried. So, while polygamy was certainly accepted and popular, even at its height, there were still plenty of men and women who chose monogamy. As a side note, in their study, polygamy was actually least common in the ward composed of 95% immigrants. But if a man wanted to take on another wife, what did that process actually look like? I'll admit, in the past, I've imagined plural marriage as if it was sort of a free-for-all, with men looking to almost collect women like Pokemon.
No! Already taken by someone who was on time.
But the reality was different. My search for answers took me from the internet to this book, which led me to a stash of old books in my kid's closet, where I found this book, which I inherited from my grandpa probably 20 years ago and have finally had the opportunity to use. Apostle Orson Pratt taught in 1853, "Before any man takes the least step towards getting another wife, it is his duty to consult the feelings of the wife which he already has, and obtain her consent." Now, while this was the expectation and the standard, it didn't always pan out this way. And if the wife didn't have a good reason to tell her husband no, good reason is a subjective term there, then he could still move forward with the plural marriage. Of course, that probably wouldn't be the best foundation for a happy home, and we'll circle back around to this when we talk about divorce. But this was only the first step. Plural marriage, like a monogamous sealing in the temple today, was considered to be a priesthood ordinance. Pratt noted that no man in Utah who already has a wife has any right to make any propositions of marriage to another lady until he has consulted the president over the whole church. If Brigham Young said no, that was the end of it. And he did sometimes say no. Peter Schertz is one rather brutal example of that. Peter liked to live in the more remote regions of southern Utah and wasn't much of a people person. In response to his petition to take on another wife, Brigham Young responded,
"Dear brother, until you are willing to live where a family can be safe and have a reasonable opportunity for social enjoyment and improvement, I am of the opinion that it will be altogether best for you to continue to lead the life of a hermit, for I know of no woman worth a groat who would be willing to agree with your wild, unsocial ways for any length of time. Your brother in the gospel, Brigham Young."
Of course, Brigham Young wasn't familiar with everyone in Utah, so many men and women would have their bishop or stake president send in a letter of recommendation. If the president approved of the union, the man would then need to get the permission of the prospective fiance's parents. Pratt wrote that if their consent cannot be obtained, this also ends the matter. If they said yes, then the man could finally approach the woman. If she said no, that was also the end of it. If she said yes, then they could go ahead and plan the marriage ceremony. Regarding courtship of plural wives, Brittany Nash wrote that many women who became plural wives experienced little to no courtship, which appealed to Victorian sensitivities about the appropriate behavior of married men. Mary Farrell remembered that
married men didn't do any courting of their plural wives. Why, we would have thought it dishonorable for a mature married man to go sparking around like a young man. They just came and asked us, and if we wanted them, we agreed.
How about married?
I'd have to finish my chores.
Of course, experiences varied, but researcher Catherine Danes acknowledged that most stories confirm this kind of restraint when courting plural wives. Now, for most of my life, I've thought that polygamy was not inherently fair to women and that monogamy was inherently fair to women. But the reality is that in the 19th century, to a degree, both polygamy and monogamy were unfair to women, though perhaps in different ways. In marriage and in society at large, women were considered subordinate to men. Getting divorced in the United States was relatively difficult, especially if initiated by a woman. But in polygamous Utah, the opposite was true. Getting an ecclesiastical divorce was relatively easy, especially if initiated by a woman. In my research, I happened upon an official journal entry that sheds some light on what Brigham Young thought about divorce. He liked a woman to live with her husband as long as she could bear with him, and if her life became too burdensome, then leave and get a divorce. In one 1861 speech, he went so far as to say that when a woman becomes alienated in her feelings and affections for her husband, it is then his duty to give her a bill of divorcement and set her free. George Q. Cannon wrote in 1879 that the liberty upon this point of divorce rests with the woman, and as regards a separation, if her position should become irksome or distasteful to her even, and she should desire a separation, not only is the man bound to respect it, but he is bound also to give her and her offspring a proportionate share of his whole property. Divorce was still generally discouraged, and unhappy marriages certainly still existed, but in 1870, Utah likely had the highest divorce rate in the country. Brigham Young, Wilford Woodruff, and Joseph F. Smith all had wives who divorced them. Polygamy in Utah wasn't butterflies and rainbows. It was understandably heart-wrenching for a lot of people, and mistakes were certainly made. But as researcher Richard Van Wagner pointed out, contrary to popular 19th century notions about polygamy, the Mormon harem, dominated by lascivious males with hyperactive libidos, did not exist. The image of unlimited lust was largely the creation of Gentile travelers to Salt Lake City, more interested in titillating audiences back home than in accurately portraying plural marriage. And unfortunately, that same representation of polygamy is perpetuated to this day. Speaking of important topics being diluted with sensationalism, have you ever heard the claim that Brigham Young would lace sacks of flour with broken glass, which he then gave to Native Americans? That's what we investigate in this episode. Go check it out and have a great day.